The night of September 11, 1980 carried a stillness that only coastal towns like Norfolk, Virginia, could know. The late summer air hung heavy with humidity, and the rhythmic whisper of the tide against the shore was the only sound that dared to break the calm. In a quiet neighborhood on Graydon Avenue, the streetlights flickered softly over trimmed lawns and picket fences. Behind one of those doors in a tidy two-story home, 25-year-old Kathleen O'Brien Doyle settled in for the night. She had always been the kind of person who carried warmth wherever she went. Her friends described her as bright, compassionate, and endlessly curious. Kathleen was in the middle of her medical studies, balancing the demands of her program while supporting her husband, a Navy pilot frequently away on deployment. It wasn't unusual for her to be alone for stretches of time, and those who knew her said she handled solitude with quiet strength. That evening, Kathleen spoke briefly with her parents on the phone. She told them she'd spent the day studying and planned to turn in early. She had no reason to feel uneasy. Norfolk, though bustling with military activity, was a safe community, especially their neighborhood. After hanging up, she straightened up the living room, folded a light blanket over the arm of the couch, and turned off the television. Somewhere outside, a dog barked in the distance and a car door slammed. It was the kind of ordinary noise that blended into the night. Kathleen walked up the stairs to her bedroom, unaware that these small, mundane moments would be the last peaceful ones of her life. Around midnight, a faint sound rippled through the quiet street. One neighbor would later recall hearing what she thought was glass breaking, a sharp noise quickly swallowed by the wind. Another remembered her dog growling restlessly for several minutes before settling back down. But no one called the police. In 1980, it wasn't common for people to immediately react to such things. Neighborhoods were close-knit and trusting. A sudden noise didn't mean danger, it was probably nothing, everyone thought. Behind Kathleen's front door, however, something terrible was unfolding. No one knew how the intruder got in. The police later speculated that Kathleen may have left a window unlocked, or that the person had found a way to quietly pry one open. The faint crash the neighbor heard might have been the sound of glass giving way, a small shard breaking as someone forced entry. Inside, the stillness of the house turned ominous. Kathleen may have woken to the sound, confused, heart racing, wondering if she'd imagined it. Maybe she walked to the top of the stairs to listen. Maybe she whispered her husband's name out of instinct before remembering he wasn't there. The man inside her house wasn't there by accident. Whether he'd been watching her or simply saw an opportunity, no one could ever be sure. But one thing was clear, he knew what he was doing. He moved quietly, deliberately. The living room showed no sign of immediate struggle. The real violence began upstairs in the privacy of Kathleen's bedroom. Sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., Kathleen was attacked with brutal force. The killer was methodical and merciless. When the details later came to light, even seasoned detectives would describe the crime scene as one of the most horrifying they'd ever encountered. Kathleen had fought back, that much was clear. Bruises and defensive wounds showed that she hadn't gone down easily. But against the strength and rage of her attacker, she didn't stand a chance. The sound of the struggle was muffled by the thick walls of the old home, lost beneath a hum of ceiling fans and the distant waves of the Chesapeake Bay. Hours later, as dawn crept over Norfolk, the street came alive again. Children got ready for school, neighbors brewed their morning coffee, and the postman began his route. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Kathleen's house sat in silence, the morning light slanting through her curtains, illuminating a home that no longer felt alive. When she didn't show up for work later that morning, her colleagues were the first to notice something was wrong. Kathleen was punctual to a fault, the kind of person who arrived early for everything. A few phone calls went unanswered. Her friends assumed she had overslept or wasn't feeling well. But as the day stretched on, concern turned to worry. By afternoon, one of her co-workers contacted the police for a welfare check. Officer John Simmons was among the first to arrive. The front door was slightly ajar. He called out Kathleen's name, but there was no response. The house smelled faintly of coffee and lavender, the scent of the candle she had burned the previous evening. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance, but a growing sense of dread hung in the air. The officer's steps echoed as he climbed the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the dim light of the hallway. When he reached the bedroom, the beam of his light froze on something dark and motionless. The scene was a nightmare. Kathleen lay lifeless, her body showing signs of a violent struggle. The room was in disarray. Drawers pulled out, jewelry scattered across the carpet, a bedside lamp knocked over. Simmons radioed for backup, his voice tight with shock. Within minutes, detectives and crime scene technicians flooded the small house. The hum of police radios and the click of cameras replaced the eerie silence that had lingered there for hours. News of the murder spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors stood on their porches in disbelief, clutching their robes as they whispered to one another. Kathleen O'Brien Doyle wasn't just another name. She was part of the community, a friendly face who waved every morning and stopped to chat on her evening walks. The idea that someone could have entered her home and committed such an act shattered any illusion of safety the area once had. Her husband, stationed out of state, received the devastating call that afternoon. Those who witnessed his reaction said the pain in his voice was something they'd never forget. Within hours, he was on a plane home, his world forever changed. Kathleen's parents, too, were inconsolable. Their daughter had been young, full of promise, with her whole future ahead of her. Detectives worked tirelessly that first day, collecting fingerprints, fibers, and any trace of DNA they could find. Though in 1980, forensic technology was limited. Every neighbor was questioned, every lead followed, but there was little to go on. The lack of forced entry confused investigators. Did she know her killer? Had she opened the door for someone she trusted? Or had the intruder been skilled enough to slip in without leaving a trace? As night fell on Norfolk once again, the Doyle home remained sealed with yellow crime scene tape. Flashlights flickered through the windows as detectives combed every inch for clues. Outside, reporters gathered, cameras flashing, their headlines already taking shape. Young woman murdered in Norfolk home invasion. But behind the headlines was something deeper, a sense of dread that this wasn't random, that a monster had walked their streets and disappeared without a sound. That night, as the last officers left the scene, a soft rain began to fall over Graydon Avenue. It washed across the sidewalk, over the driveway, and down the gutters, carrying with it the last traces of the day's horror. In the days and weeks that followed, Norfolk would mourn Kathleen Doyle, the young woman whose smile had brightened every room she entered. No one knew that it would take more than 4 decades, countless false leads and advances in technology not yet dreamed of, to finally bring her killer to justice. But that night in 1980, all anyone could feel was fear, disbelief, and the echo of a single haunting question. How could something so evil happen in a place so ordinary? When investigators returned to Kathleen O'Brien Doyle's home the next morning, the bright Virginia sunlight did little to soften the horror that lingered behind the walls. The white 2-story house stood quiet, deceptively peaceful from the outside. Inside, it was a maze of chaos and unanswered questions. Detectives moved carefully through each room, their eyes tracing the details of a night that had turned violent beyond comprehension. Every corner, every overturned item felt like a whisper from Kathleen's final moments, and the weight of it hung thick in the air. Detective Sergeant Thomas Moore, one of the lead investigators, had seen his share of violent crimes, but nothing quite like this. The brutality shocked even the most seasoned officers. The scene showed no mercy, no hesitation. It was as if the killer had been consumed by rage. Kathleen had clearly fought hard. There were signs of struggle everywhere. The bed sheets torn, a lamp shattered, a picture frame cracked on the floor. The medical examiner would later confirm that she had been sexually assaulted before being murdered, an act of violence that seemed deeply personal. It wasn't just an impulsive burglary. It was deliberate, focused, and cruel. For hours, technicians photographed, dusted, and bagged everything that might hold a clue. The bedroom, hallway, and even the bathroom were examined for fingerprints or trace evidence. Fibers were collected from the bed, the floor, and even under Kathleen's fingernails. They found a partial fingerprint on the window frame, but it was too smudged to identify. A small piece of cloth was discovered near the foot of the bed. It didn't match any of Kathleen's clothing. And on the nightstand, they found her wedding ring missing. The drawers had been opened and rifled through, but strangely, cash and valuable items like her silver watch and purse remained untouched. If robbery had been the motive, it didn't make sense. When they spoke to the neighbors, most said the night had been quiet. One woman recalled hearing glass break but assumed it was from the wind or a tree branch. Another said she saw a shadow move near Kathleen's window around midnight, but dismissed it as her imagination. No one had seen anyone enter or leave the house. No strange cars were reported on the street. The neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone trusted everyone. People left their doors unlocked and waved to passing strangers. That sense of security evaporated overnight. Kathleen's husband, stationed in Florida at the time, arrived home later that day. The grief on his face spoke louder than words. He stood in disbelief at the sight of his home, now filled with police and reporters. He was questioned immediately, as was protocol, but it was clear from the start that he wasn't a suspect. He'd been on active duty hundreds of miles away. The pain he carried wasn't guilt, it was heartbreak. In interviews, he spoke about their last phone call, how she'd seemed cheerful, how she told him she missed him and couldn't wait for him to come home. He couldn't understand who would want to hurt her. Investigators began to map out Kathleen's final days. They interviewed her classmates, her professors, her friends, and even local shop owners. Everyone described her the same way: kind, ambitious, genuine. She had no enemies, no strange ex-boyfriends, no feuds with anyone. She wasn't the kind of person who attracted danger. But sometimes danger didn't need an invitation. Sometimes it found its way to you by chance, or by someone watching quietly, waiting for the right moment. For weeks, the Norfolk Police Department followed every lead they could find. They chased down reports of suspicious men seen in the area, checked local sex offenders, and reviewed cases of home invasions in nearby cities. They even explored the possibility of a connection to military personnel, since Norfolk had a large naval base. But each lead fizzled out. The killer had left behind almost nothing that could be traced with the technology available in 1980. DNA testing wasn't yet a reality, and forensic science could only do so much. All they had were a few fibers, a partial print, and a growing sense of frustration. Detectives considered the possibility that Kathleen had known her killer. The lack of forced entry suggested she might have opened the door willingly. Maybe she had let in someone she trusted, a friend, a neighbor, or perhaps someone posing as a repairman or delivery worker. Yet no one in her circle matched the evidence, and no one had any motive. The investigation reached a painful standstill. Kathleen's funeral drew hundreds of mourners. Family, friends, classmates, and local residents filled the church until there was standing room only. The air was heavy with grief and confusion. The priest spoke softly about her kindness and her dedication to helping others, calling her a soul taken too soon, in a world that didn't deserve her light. Her husband sat in the front row, head bowed, hands trembling. Her parents could barely stand. The entire community felt the loss. But behind their tears was something else: fear. If someone could do this to Kathleen, no one felt safe anymore. After the funeral, the case grew colder by the day. Detectives rotated off the investigation as new crimes demanded attention. The boxes of evidence were sealed, labeled, and placed in storage. Every few years, someone would reopen them, hoping for a new lead. but there was never anything new. The case file grew thicker with time, thousands of pages of interviews, tips, and reports that led nowhere. Norfolk police refused to call it unsolvable, but it was clear they were running out of hope. Kathleen's parents never stopped fighting for answers. They called the department regularly, asking for updates, writing letters to anyone who might help. They even reached out to television programs that covered unsolved murders, hoping national attention might shake something loose. For decades, nothing did. Kathleen's husband eventually remarried, though those close to him said he never truly recovered. He moved away from Virginia, trying to escape the memories that haunted every street, every corner, every shadow. As the 1990s rolled into the 2000s, forensic technology began to change. DNA analysis became more advanced, allowing detectives to revisit old cases with new tools. Across the country, cold cases were being solved one by one as stored evidence yielded long-hidden truths. But in Norfolk, Kathleen's case remained quiet. There were rumors that the evidence had degraded over time, that maybe there wasn't enough left to test. Still, the investigators who remembered her never forgot. Some had retired, others passed away, but each one carried the image of that young woman in their minds. In 2018, after nearly 4 decades, a new generation of detectives decided to try again. They pulled the evidence from storage, carefully reopening each box. Inside were the fibers, the fingerprints, the sealed envelopes containing preserved biological samples. They reached out to a state forensic lab equipped with the latest DNA technology. If even a fragment of genetic material remained, they could run it through national databases that hadn't existed in 1980. It took months of testing, but when the results came back, the room fell silent. The DNA from the crime scene matched a man already in the system, Dennis Bowman, a convicted felon living in Michigan. Bowman's record was dark, filled with assaults, break-ins, and violent behavior. He had once been charged for attacking another young woman around the same time Kathleen was killed. It seemed almost impossible that his name had never surfaced before. But back then, police departments didn't have nationwide databases or digital records. Crimes in one state often had no connection to another. The revelation reignited the case. Detectives pored over Bowman's past, tracing his movements in 1980. They discovered he had been stationed near Norfolk while serving in the Navy. He had lived less than 20 miles away from Kathleen's home. The timelines aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Suddenly, a case that had been cold for 40 years was burning hot again. For the first time, Kathleen's family heard the name of the man who had stolen her future. The decades of wondering, of unanswered questions, began to crumble under the weight of truth. The murder that had seemed destined to remain a mystery was about to find justice. But what investigators didn't know yet was that Bowman's evil stretched far beyond Kathleen's death. The monster who had slipped silently into her home that night had lived a life full of darkness, hiding in plain sight. The case that had haunted Norfolk for 40 years was about to uncover horrors no one could have imagined. As the years turned into decades, the murder of Kathleen O'Brien Doyle became one of the most haunting cold cases in Virginia's history. Her name remained a quiet echo through the Norfolk Police Department, whispered in conversations between detectives who still remembered the young woman with the gentle smile and unfulfilled future. The case file had been opened and closed so many times that its edges were frayed, its pages yellowed with age. Every few years, a new detective would take a look, hoping to see something others had missed. But time had dulled memories, witnesses had moved away, and the evidence, though carefully preserved, had never given up its secrets. It seemed as though the answers would remain locked in 1980 forever. That began to change in 2018, when forensic science reached a level that could finally do what decades of investigation could not. Detective Mark Caprio, who had joined the Norfolk Police Cold Case Unit years earlier, made it his mission to revisit unsolved homicides. especially those with physical evidence that could still be tested. He had grown up hearing about the Kathleen Doyle case even before becoming a cop. Her story stuck with him, the young wife murdered in her own home while her husband served the country. It was a story that deserved an ending. Caprio retrieved the evidence boxes that had sat untouched for nearly 40 years. He handled them as if they were made of glass, understanding that every item inside carried the possibility of truth. Among the contents were clothing fibers, pieces of tape, hair strands, and sealed swabs taken from the crime scene. The chain of custody had been maintained meticulously, allowing them to be reanalyzed using new methods of DNA testing, far more sensitive than anything available in 1980. Samples were sent to the Virginia Department of Forensic Science, and from there the process began. The lab technicians worked slowly and carefully, isolating genetic material from the preserved evidence. Even after all those years, some of it was viable. When the first DNA profile emerged, the excitement in the lab was electric. For the first time in decades, they had something tangible, something living inside the data. That profile was then uploaded to CODIS, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI. When the system ran the search, it returned a hit. The name that appeared shocked everyone: Dennis Lee Bowman. The match wasn't partial, it was definitive. The DNA from the crime scene inside Kathleen Doyle's bedroom matched Bowman's profile exactly. Caprio sat staring at the computer screen for what felt like an eternity, the magnitude of it sinking in. A man who had escaped justice for nearly 40 years was suddenly pulled into the light. Bowman wasn't an unfamiliar name to law enforcement. He had a record that stretched back decades, marked with violence and deceit. In 1980, the same year Kathleen was murdered, he was living in Virginia while serving in the Navy. After his service, he returned to Michigan, where he built a quiet life that masked the darkness beneath. He married, had children, and worked ordinary jobs, blending seamlessly into suburban life. But his criminal history never truly disappeared. He had been arrested for burglary, assault, and later probation violations. Still, nothing ever tied him to murder until now. When detectives began digging deeper, what they found was horrifying. Bowman had been charged years earlier with the attempted assault of another young woman in the Norfolk area, only months before Kathleen's murder. The pattern was undeniable. He preyed on women when his wife wasn't around, targeting them in moments of isolation, using charm or deceit to get close before revealing his true nature. He had slipped through the cracks for decades, protected by time and the lack of technology to expose him. Detectives in Virginia reached out to the Michigan State Police, and together they began building a case. Bowman was 70 years old now, a gray-haired man living quietly in a rural Michigan town, where neighbors described him as friendly, even helpful. They had no idea of the monster living among them. When officers arrived at his home with an arrest warrant, Bowman didn't run. He stood calmly on his porch, watching them approach. His face betrayed no surprise, no fear. He simply said, "I knew this day would come." It was a chilling statement, one that confirmed what detectives had suspected all along. He had known what he'd done and carried it with him for 40 years. Inside his house, police found stacks of old papers, photographs, and personal items from decades past. It was as if he had been living surrounded by ghosts of his own making. During questioning, Bowman remained cold and uncooperative. He denied knowing Kathleen Doyle, denied ever being in her home, and claimed the DNA evidence must have been contaminated. But the forensic results were irrefutable. His genetic material had been found in multiple locations within the crime scene. There was no mistake. As the news broke, it spread rapidly across Virginia. The murder of Kathleen Doyle had long been a painful mystery, and now the face of her killer was finally known. For her family, it was a bittersweet moment. Relief that justice was near, but anguish that it had taken so long. Her parents had passed away years earlier, never knowing the truth. Her husband, older now and remarried, spoke briefly to the press, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Kathleen deserved better," he said. "She deserved a full life. I hope this finally brings her peace." In the following months, prosecutors meticulously reconstructed the case, connecting Bowman's past behaviors to the brutality of Kathleen's murder. Old reports and witness statements were re-examined, and several people who had known Bowman came forward with disturbing stories. One woman described how he had once followed her home late at night during his Navy days. Another recalled him boasting about breaking into homes without getting caught. The pieces began to fit together, revealing a man who had lived a double life. A predator hiding beneath the mask of a husband and father. Then came the most disturbing revelation of all. As Michigan investigators dug deeper into Bowman's background, they uncovered another tragedy tied directly to him, one that stretched beyond Virginia. His adopted daughter, Andrea Bowman, had gone missing in 1989 when she was just 14. For years, Bowman claimed she had run away. Police searched, but no trace of her was ever found. Her disappearance was classified as a runaway case, and he was never charged. But in light of his arrest for Kathleen Doyle's murder, detectives began to re-examine that story. What they discovered was chilling. In 2020, after questioning Bowman again, he finally confessed that Andrea hadn't run away. He had killed her, buried her remains behind their home, and lived for decades pretending she was still out there somewhere. The discovery of her body confirmed the truth. The same man who had murdered Kathleen O'Brien Doyle in Virginia had later murdered his own adopted daughter in Michigan. The pattern of violence that began in 1980 had never stopped. It had simply gone underground. When prosecutors presented this information to the court, it painted a devastating picture of who Bowman truly was. He was not a man who lost control one night. He was a predator who thrived on manipulation, power, and silence. Kathleen had been one of his earliest victims, a young woman full of life and promise whose death marked the beginning of his monstrous trail. As his trial date approached, Bowman's expression never changed. He showed no remorse, no guilt, no emotion. He pleaded guilty to Andrea's murder in Michigan, and later agreed to extradition to Virginia to face the charges for Kathleen's murder. For the Norfolk detectives who had carried her case for so long, the sight of him in handcuffs felt like the closing of a wound that had bled for 40 years. They had never given up, and finally their persistence had brought the truth to light. In the court documents that followed, prosecutors described the crime as an act of pure evil. Bowman's crimes spanned decades and states, but they shared one thing in common: innocence destroyed by a man who lived without conscience. When reporters asked the lead detective what it felt like to finally solve such a cold case, he said quietly, "It's not victory, it's closure. We can't bring Kathleen back, but we can make sure her story doesn't end with silence." The DNA match had done more than solve a murder. It had revealed the hidden life of a killer who thought time would protect him. Bowman had lived for decades believing he was safe, that the past was buried. But science had given the dead their voice back, and that voice pointed directly to him. In the end, justice came slowly, but it came unrelenting. Just as the tides outside Norfolk had done every day since that night in 1980. Steady, patient, and unstoppable. In 2020, after 4 decades of silence, the Norfolk Police Department stood before the cameras to make the announcement the city had waited years to hear. The 1980 murder of Kathleen O'Brien Doyle had been solved. For those who had lived through the fear and heartbreak of that time, the words felt almost unreal. Journalists filled the room, the hum of their recorders mixing with the low murmur of anticipation. Behind the podium, Detective Mark Caprio adjusted the microphone, his face solemn. "We never stopped looking for Kathleen's killer," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "And today we can finally say we found him." The name that followed, Dennis Lee Bowman, cut through the air like a blade. A man who had lived an entire life in the shadow of his own crimes was finally being brought to justice. The news spread quickly across Virginia and Michigan, reaching every corner of the country. For Kathleen's surviving family members, the moment was both vindication and heartbreak. They had waited for this truth for 40 years, and while justice had finally arrived, it came decades too late. Kathleen's parents had gone to their graves without knowing who killed their daughter. Her husband, now older and quieter, released a brief statement. "Kathleen was the light of my life," it read. "Her loss changed everything. I'm grateful that the person responsible will finally answer for what he did. But no amount of time or punishment can make up for what he took from her, or from all of us." In Michigan, the man responsible sat in a small interrogation room, his hands cuffed in front of him. Dennis Bowman was 70 years old now, gray-haired and frail-looking, but there was nothing fragile about his eyes. They were cold, calculating, and detached, as if he were a spectator to his own downfall. Detectives from Virginia sat across from him, their case files thick with evidence. They showed him the DNA reports, the photographs from 1980, the timelines that placed him near Kathleen's home. Bowman barely reacted. "I don't know that woman," he said in a low voice. "Never been to Virginia." But the detectives didn't argue. They didn't have to. The science spoke for itself. When his trial date was set, prosecutors prepared a case that would lay out every detail of the crime piece by piece, revealing the horror that had remained hidden for 4 decades. They described how Bowman, then a 31-year-old Navy serviceman stationed near Norfolk, had targeted Kathleen while her husband was deployed. He had likely followed her for days, learning her routine, waiting for the night she was alone. He had broken into her home, assaulted her, and taken her life with brutality so severe that investigators could never forget what they saw. The evidence preserved by luck and care was now his undoing. As the trial began, the courtroom filled with faces. Reporters, law students, old detectives who had once worked the case, and members of the community who remembered the 1980 murder that had once terrified Norfolk. Bowman sat motionless, showing no sign of regret. The prosecutor spoke with precision, painting the picture of a predator who had lived freely while his victim's memory was frozen in time. They showed photographs of Kathleen, smiling and alive, her eyes bright with the promise of a future she never got to have. They played recordings of the original investigators describing the crime scene, their voices breaking even 40 years later. And finally, they presented the DNA results, the undeniable link between the evidence from Kathleen's home and Bowman's own genetic profile. When Bowman's defense tried to argue contamination or procedural error, the prosecution countered with overwhelming proof that the DNA was untouched and authentic. The defense's words fell flat. No jury could look at the evidence and doubt the truth. The man sitting in front of them had done it, and for years he had walked the streets with the arrogance of someone who believed time had erased his sins. During the sentencing phase, several people spoke about Kathleen and the impact her death had on their lives. Her cousin, now in her 60s, stood before the court with tears in her eyes. "We lived 40 years without answers," she said. 40 years of wondering who did this. 40 years of thinking she might have known him, trusted him, maybe even smiled at him before he took everything away. He got to live. He got to grow old. She didn't. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobs from the gallery. When it was his turn to speak, Bowman said nothing. He refused to make a statement, refused to look at Kathleen's family, refused to acknowledge the devastation he had caused. The judge, a man who had been a young prosecutor in Norfolk in the 1980s, looked at him with visible disgust. "You hid behind time," he said. "You thought decades would bury your crimes. But time didn't protect you, it revealed you. The truth always finds its way to the surface." Then he pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As Bowman was led out of the courtroom, reporters shouted questions, but he kept his head down. For the detectives, there was no applause, no sense of triumph, just quiet satisfaction. Justice had taken 40 years, but it had arrived all the same. Detective Caprio, standing outside the courthouse, told a group of reporters, "This case taught us something important. No murder is truly cold. Not if there's still evidence and someone willing to fight for it." Kathleen's story deserved an ending, and today she finally got one. But the story didn't end there. In Michigan, more horrors surfaced. Bowman's confession to the murder of his adopted daughter, Andrea, sent shockwaves through the nation. Her remains were found buried behind his home, confirming what her mother had feared for 30 years. The parallels between the two cases were undeniable. Both victims were young, both were vulnerable, and both were silenced by the same man. Bowman's crime stretched across time and state lines, revealing a lifetime of deceit. He had lived outwardly as a husband, a father, a neighbor, while hiding the darkest secrets imaginable. When news of the connection between the two murders broke, it reignited public interest in the Kathleen Doyle case. Documentaries and crime shows revisited the story, tracing the long path from 1980 to 2020. Former detectives gave interviews, recalling sleepless nights, dead ends, and the constant fear that the killer would never be caught. They spoke of the frustration of working without DNA technology, of keeping hope alive when the case seemed hopeless. One retired officer said, "It's not just about solving a murder. It's about keeping a promise. We told her family we'd find him, and now we finally did." In Norfolk, a small memorial was held for Kathleen outside the home where she once lived. The current residents placed flowers on the front step, surrounded by candles that flickered softly in the autumn wind. People who had never met her came to pay their respects, drawn by the story of a woman whose life had become a symbol of resilience and justice delayed but not denied. Her photograph, the same one that had appeared in newspapers in 1980, was placed at the center of the display. She was smiling, radiant, forever 25. As the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, the streetlights flickered on just as they had the night she died. For the first time in 40 years, there was peace on Graydon Avenue. The fear that had once gripped the community had faded into memory, replaced by something stronger: closure. The Doyle family finally had answers, and Kathleen's name was no longer just part of a cold case file. It was part of a story of perseverance, faith, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Dennis Bowman would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his days marked not by freedom but by the weight of the lives he destroyed. In prison, he was just another number, stripped of the control and arrogance he once carried. For the detectives who had seen the case through to the end, that was enough. They knew that justice, though delayed, had caught up to him in the end. In the quiet reflection that followed, one thought remained constant among those who had fought to bring the truth forward. Evil can hide for years. It can change faces. It can bury itself beneath decades of silence, but it cannot escape forever. The past has a way of resurfacing, and when it does, it demands to be heard. The murder of Kathleen O'Brien Doyle was not just a tragedy. It was a reminder that even the coldest cases can be warmed by the light of truth. Her story, once defined by violence, now stood as a testament to endurance. And though the world had changed beyond recognition since that night in 1980, the echoes of her voice, soft, hopeful, and unyielding, seemed to whisper one final truth: justice may be late, but it never truly dies.